This brings us to the speaker of the day, and Andy Anderson is making a reappearance. Some of you may have missed out on one or a couple of the previous speeches that he's made, and therefore I thought it'd be a good idea to have a look at a review of what's been covered so far, because his first talk on the subject of his career was 6 months ago, and a lot of time has passed since then. So this is to jog your memory. Andy was one of the enthusiasts that started gliding in pre-war days at City Beach. He also flew at Lake Pinjar in the same period, roughly the same period. That's an early photo of a breezy. And West Subiaco Aerodrome became the home of gliding before and during the start of World War II. Andy was an apprentice at Commercial Aviation after the war started, and he had to use a little bit of his manipulative power to get himself into the Air Force. I don't know whether he described it to you, but he described it to me as to how he had to be a bit devious to get into the Air Force. After training, he ended up in England, flying out of Plymouth, flying Sunderlands, and looking on patrol, looking for German submarines, U-boats. There's a U-boat, and that's what they were up to. In the mid-Atlantic, they had pretty well free rein because aircraft didn't have the range to get out there until the very long-range Liberator came into the fleet. After World War II, this takes us up to Andy's last talk, just a refresher here. He came back to Australia and flew DC-3s on the east-west run, and then up and down the east coast of Australia, Brisbane to Tasmania. In 1949 he went back to England and started working for the carriers, which were commercial carriers and charter. There were lots of takeovers, lots of companies forming, lots of companies being gobbled up, and Andy was in the midst of all this, flying a whole range of aircraft. Let's not forget that before Andy came down to tell us about his time flying in Australia and Europe, he received the Legion of Honour in Albany in the reenactment down there. I remember the day that he brought the medallion down here, and I remember saying to him, "Can I touch it?" I felt pretty proud being able to touch it. And let's not forget how we finished up the last meeting, where Andy was awarded membership as a Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. So Andy's going to be carrying on with some more information about his career in Europe and particularly the Middle East in Kuwait. So Andy, this is up to you. The stool's there ready for you to sit on.
At the conclusion of my sojourn in Berlin, flying the corridors. Now, that exercise was like running my own little airline, and at the end of that successful 12 months or more, I returned to the UK. I fortunately wrote a letter to the management of British European Airways, for whom we were operating, and a copy to the manager's head office, which did him no harm. and he reciprocated by doing something similar for me. So that when I got back to England, I was quite a favourite, and they asked me what I'd like to do now. I immediately said I'd like to transfer to long haul. After puddle jumping out of Berlin, I was a bit tired of little short hops. So they sent me off on a course with the Britannia. A lot had happened while I was away in Berlin, and we had a new CEO named Freddie Laker. Now, perhaps a lot of you are familiar with his story, but Freddie was an entrepreneur of the old school. He was an East Ender and proud of it. Made his money after the war by getting contracts with the British government to remove scrap metal from battlefields. And he also had a hand in the Berlin airlift by purchasing old aircraft, filling them up with goods that was required in Berlin, and the government paid him for that. So the company I was working for took over his business, which was called Aviation Traders, and that included a Bristol freighter, which Freddie had converted to carry motor cars, and also a DC-4 that he'd converted for longer haul with motor cars, and he called the service Air Ferries. So I loaded my car on to the Bristol freighter at Rotterdam and flew over to the United Kingdom. And after a bit of leave, there was also a picture of my car on the DC-4, which was the Carve Air, and that was at the end of a holiday I was given, so we'd spent most of it in Switzerland. So, Freddie Laker's culture in the company I worked for. Now, the company I worked for had been renamed British United Airways because it had absorbed so many of the independent airlines in the United Kingdom. And the government were gradually relaxing their laws on independent airlines and allowing them to compete to a certain extent with the corporations. The corporations were, of course, their pet, and nothing could possibly be allowed to compete with them. So, on the East African safari services that we ran to Nairobi and Salisbury, known as Harare, we used now the Britannias. The Britannia used to fly direct to Entebbe, where we had crew changes, and then the aircraft would either fly on to Nairobi or down to what was then Salisbury. Now, there were one or two amusing things that happened, well, one not amusing, one or two incidents that happened I'd like to relate to you, and that was out of Entebbe. The first one was lake flies. Now, you've probably never heard of lake flies, but when they massed over Lake Victoria, they could actually asphyxiate fishermen. There's no way fishermen could avoid them, and they would breathe them and they would die. They were so thick. So on this occasion, the aircraft had taken off from Entebbe, and it was late evening, so the captain didn't spot this huge cloud of lake flies, and flew into it. Consequently, the power on all four engines was dropped. It was like flying into volcano dust, really, and the windscreen was clouded over. So, having realized what he'd done, he then had two choices. He had the choice of throwing fuel out if he could maintain altitude, and try and get back to Entebbe, or the second choice which he took was to fly into a nearby thunderstorm. Now that was a brilliant thing to do, because as he hit the heavy rain, so it washed out the engines and cleared his windscreen, and he continued his climb and went on to the United Kingdom. They should have given him a medal, but they didn't even refer to it. So, now the second incident I'd like to refer you to was Idi Amin had promoted one of his friends to be Chief Customs Officer. We'd boarded the aircraft, passengers boarded, and we were about to call up for startup clearance when the tower told us that the Chief Customs Officer wanted to see the captain. So I had to call up the steps and get out and walk across the tarmac to this man's office. And when I entered the office, I'd never seen such a sight in my life. There was this great big man with such a uniform that there was so much gold braid on it that, it was quite staggering. And I asked him what the problem was, and he said to me, "The captain, your aircraft is impounded." So I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because the crew am smuggling." And I said, "Smuggling? What are they smuggling?" "They are smuggling gems." Now that really threw me, and I thought, how can... And so I said to this man, "What sort of gems are they smuggling?" And he said, "I have seen them. I have seen them in the little shops in the Dukas. They're for sale." I said, "What sort of gems?" He said, "There are the strawberry gems and the raspberry gems and the plum gems." So you can see what happened. I mean, these guys just rifled the gas bags and took out any of those little pots of jam that appeared that people had for their breakfast. And of course sold them at the... So I asked the Chief Customs Officer what he intended to do. I imagined that there would be some sort of a fine for this terrible smuggling, and he agreed. So he said 100 American dollars, which he immediately put into his wallet, and we were allowed to leave. So, keeping on the subject of the Britannia, we also used the Britannia for long trooping contracts, and we would carry British troops to and from Hong Kong, to and from Singapore, and Labuan. They were also we were involved in the evacuation of British troops from Aden. Now, that was at a time when the insurgents were insisting that Aden or Yemen gained its independence, and they were fighting, I suppose you'd call it, the British Army, and they had more or less circled Aden. And the British Army had decided that they would like to evacuate rather than and the government said they can have their independence. We don't really need Aden anymore. However, the problem was for us that the insurgents had become very close to Aden, and therefore we could only operate at night without lights, and that really was quite hazardous. When you got near Aden, all the lights had to be turned off. We were not allowed to use landing lights, and we certainly weren't allowed to use running lights, and all the lights in the cabin were turned off because these insurgents could actually shoot at the aircraft as it approached the runway. So that was the Britannia. The Britannia was not my favorite aeroplane, and the reason was because of the culture of Freddie Laker, who insisted aircraft should fly low and fast rather than high and slow. And the reason for that was, in his thinking, that fuel was so cheap at the time and maintenance was so expensive that the faster you got there and the faster you got home, the less it would cost the company. However, he pushed that as far as actually creating a ladder upon which he would put the captain's names, being the fastest, on the top, and the ones who were the slowest were on the bottom. Now that created awful problems because captains were actually cutting corners on the airway, and they were doing straight-in approaches when it would have been much safer for them to do a circuit first, and it really was creating a very bad. So, Freddie Laker's attitude towards an airline was not quite what I would have considered a wise one. Now, at this time, in the 60s, a lot was happening. The British government was continuing to ease its tight grip on the independent airlines by allowing them to run scheduled services and to buy more modern aircraft. So it happened that at that time, British Overseas Airways gave up their South American service. So Freddie Laker immediately applied to the ministry to obtain this license, and he was granted. Now that also corresponded with the production of the VC-10. It was without doubt my favorite airplane. It was one of the most sophisticated aircraft that you could think of. It was the last of the Vickers production before aviation more or less came to a halt in England after the tragedy of the Comet. Now the VC-10 was designed for hot, high, short runways, and therefore the 4 conways they had in the tail were with more than enough power for the normal pilot on the normal run. So of course nothing could be more delightful than having an overpowered aeroplane. If you were cruising at 42,000 feet, as you could with this aircraft, and just below the speed of sound, the company wouldn't like us to go through the speed of sound with it. Then if you lost an engine, you just pushed the other 3 up a bit, and you couldn't do that with most airplanes. You'd have to come down and use more fuel. We've got a note here that the combined thrust of 4 Conway engines was 88,000 pounds. The flight deck was like an ensuite. We had our own toilet and our own sleeping quarters, and we had a very comfortable and sophisticated aircraft. The electrical system and the hydraulic system had emergencies, things called LRAT and Hydrat, and they were small generators that would drop out from the fuselage to keep those things generated if you had an emergency in the hydraulics or the electrics. The VC-10 took over on the East African services from the Britannia. And Freddie Laker, because he was such a showman, decided that he would do proving flights into East Africa. He even went to the stage of saying that they might appreciate the fact that he drove around in a Rolls Royce. So they opened the big freight door and they managed to get his Rolls Royce on board. So we landed at these various places in Africa to give demonstration flights, and Freddie Laker would cruise around in his Rolls Royce. We took passengers from Entebbe Uganda, and flew them around Lake Victoria, and also to the Ruwenzori, which is the mountains of the moon, which are the beginning of the Blue Nile. That's where it all starts, and they run into Lake Victoria, and the Blue Nile heads north through the Sudan to Khartoum, where it's joined by the White Nile, which rises in Abyssinia, and they together become the Nile, which runs all the way up to Cairo. Now, Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia was a guest on a particular presentation flight that I was doing. So we asked him, was there any particular place in Zambia that he wanted to see? And he said he'd very much like to fly over the Victoria Falls, which are, as you know, on the boundaries between Zambia and what is now Zimbabwe. So that's exactly what we did with him. We sat him in the jump seat and we took off and flew over the Victoria Falls. Now we flew at 500 feet and we had to have the windscreen wipers going because of the spray. Now that was quite an event, not only for Mr. Kaunda, but also for me. I thoroughly enjoyed it. A little story I've got here that I'd like to talk about BOAC. BOAC in the 70s thought that they were God's gift to aviation, and they were, because they had no competition from England at all because of the government. So everyone became terribly arrogant until we used to say that if you boarded a BOAC aircraft, which we entitled BOAC was better on a camel, that if you entered a British BOAC aircraft, you were considered, it was considered an honour that you were allowed to fly as a passenger on their aircraft. There was a little story, since we obtained our VC-10s before BOAC, that they asked if we could send a senior engineer to BOAC to help their guys out in their initial education. Now we sent this engineer who spent some time with BOAC, and when he returned, I remember asking him, what was it like? That must be a different world. And he said, well, one of the most amazing things was my first flight. And I was in the flight deck, and the BOAC flight engineer said to me, the first thing we have to do is to make sure that you know all the emergency procedures, particularly in this case as far as ditching is concerned. So he took me through all the emergencies, the cabin staff, the navigator, the first officer, the flight engineer, and exactly what they had to do in the event of emergency. And when I said to him, well, that's fine, you've told me all about the crew, now what does the captain do? And there was a long pause, and then this flight engineer said to me, oh, it's quite simple. He just puts on his white gloves and walks across the water. So now I come to the opening up of the South American service, and I was quite deeply involved in that. We had a proving flight down through Las Palmas, through to Rio de Janeiro, on to Buenos Aires, and then over the Andes to Santiago. And we did not take the Rolls-Royce this time. Freddie Laker thought that perhaps the South Americans were a little more sophisticated than the Africans, and they may not appreciate it so much. The next thing I'd like to talk about would be the approach into Santiago. That was my leg from Buenos Aires to Santiago. Santiago the other side of the Andes, as you well know, and the Andes near Santiago has mountains that run up to 22,000 feet. The safety height over the airfield, which is a pretty old airfield at the time, called Los Rios, the safety height was 25,000 feet. Now, no one in the crew had ever been there before, and we had Jefferson charts, but the only navhead was an old ADF, which is inclined to point more at thunderstorms than it does to where you want it to. So I came over the top at 25,000 feet, and believe it or not, my luck was not in. It was heavy cloud all the way down to 500 feet with this complicated descent pattern that I had to carry out. Now, fortunately for me, I'd never been to Santiago, and I knew very little about what was underneath me. And finally, when we broke cloud, the runway lights appeared, and the chief navigator, who was sitting alongside me on the jump seat, shouted out, "Andy, this is not it. It's too small." And I shouted back, "David, it's too late." So we put the aircraft down and stopped, fortunately, before the end, and turned and taxied back in the gloom. And as we turned off the runway towards the main administration building, all the lights came on and the band played and the red carpet was rolled out. And we said, thank God it was the right airfield. So that was Los Rios, which has been lost now. That wasn't a pun. Pudahuel is their new airfield, and it wasn't long after we'd been there that Pudahuel came into full force with ILS and all the other modern aids. However, we were still operating out of Los Rios for a few months, and during one of my overnights in Santiago, I happened to get into conversation with the Dunlop rep, and he was talking about V2 climbs of all things. He said he'd never seen a V2 climb, and I said to him, well, if you're at the airfield in the morning, I'll show you one. So the morning arrived, and there was this beautiful VC-10 waiting for departure. Very little fuel was required because we're only flying to Buenos Aires, and we didn't have all that many passengers. Now, I told you that because that indicates the aircraft is fairly light. And we lined up for the takeoff for this V2 climb. Now, as you all well know, there are 3 commands that the first officer gives the captain during takeoff. And the first one is V1, and that indicates that you cannot stop. You must take off because there's not enough runway left for you to brake and stop without running off the end. So he calls V1, then he calls rotate. Now that gives you time to change the attitude of the aircraft into a position to take off. The next call is V2, and that's minimum climb speed. Now, if you want to do a V2 climb, what you do then is to maintain that attitude and that speed and go up, because normally you would drop the nose to the normal climb speed and reduce the thrust. Now, in the case of the V2 climb, we reefed the airplane off the ground and did a V2 climb for this guy. And we leveled off at 3,000 feet, and we turned downwind, and I looked back at the airfield, and believe it or not, the runway was on fire. Now you can appreciate why it was on fire, because as we pulled the aircraft up to a V2 climb, thrust from these poor conways was pouring down on this very poor runway they had, and it was enough to set the bitumen alight. So I expected complaints from the tower, but there were not any, and I didn't say anything, and the whole thing was just forgotten. And I imagined that it was forgotten because they were shortly going to shift the whole operation to Pudwell, and that meant that it would reflect badly on the airfield if they'd allowed the runway to get to the condition where the macadam was breaking up to the extent that it would actually catch fire. So the whole thing was forgotten about, which was fortunate for me, I suppose. For the company may not have appreciated me sitting Los Cerritos Salt Light. So now, the next incident that I'd like to relate was coming out of Rio at night, bound for Las Palmas. We had gained altitude, 35,000 feet, leveled off, and we're halfway between Rio and Recife to the north of South America, and the first officer's window crazed. There was an enormous explosion, and the first officer's window went bang, and we saw it craze. It didn't blow out, so we didn't have an explosive decompression. The thing simply crazed because, as you know, there are 3 or 4 layers and this probably protected the windscreen. So the immediate thing, of course, was to get down from altitude. So that's quite a simple procedure, as you know. Throttles off, lay the aircraft over, full bottom rudder, and then you pull the speed brakes so that you descend in the most rapid time. We leveled off at 10,000 feet, and we then had to decide what to do with this airplane. We would either have to fly back to Rio, where we would have to wait for a replacement windscreen, or we could try and work out the possibility of how near we could get to our destination. So we carried on flying towards a normal flight path, but at 10,000 feet, while the navigator worked out, and the flight engineer, what the fuel consumption would be at that altitude and how far we could get. Now, he worked out that we could get as far as the Cape Verde Islands, which is off the west coast of Africa, and still have enough fuel for a diversion if necessary. We didn't know much about the Cape Verde Islands, so we looked it up, and it was pretty much a VFR-only airfield. So we knew it would open up only in the morning, and we worked out if we stayed at 10,000 feet what our ETA would be, and it was just smack on the time that they were due to open their airfield. So that was a great possibility, and we decided to do exactly that. The only other danger we had, of course, was the intertropical front. Now, you're fairly knowledgeable, I'm sure, about the what is now known as the intra-convergency zone, which travels up and down from the equator and carries all lousy weather with it. So over Africa, you get the long rains and the short rains. Over the South Atlantic, you would get enormous thunderstorms, the beginning of terrible hurricanes that sweep around the coast of Mexico and the Bay of Mexico and all. So that really is a nasty place. And normally at altitude, it's never a problem. You can avoid the thunderstorms quite well, and we've got very good radar. At 10,000 feet, it was a different story. So, believe it or not, that night, ladies and gentlemen, it was calm. There wasn't a thunderstorm in sight anywhere, so we had a lovely smooth trip at 10,000 feet across to the Cape Verde Island. We managed to contact the company through our HF radio, and they said they would send a replacement windscreen as soon as possible to Las Palmas. So we landed on the Cape Verde Islands at the time of their opening, and were fondly greeted as the first BC-10 to ever come in there. They refueled us, and we flew on to Las Palmas. The replacement windscreen arrived within a couple of hours of our arrival, complete with engineers to change it. So the aircraft arrived in the UK only a few hours behind schedule. So that was quite an achievement on that thing. The next thing I've got here is to talk about T-tailed aircraft. The company was equipped with T-tailed aircraft. The BAC 111 was the first T-tailed aircraft, and of course the VC-10 was a T-tailed aircraft with a tail as big as a Spitfire. That's right. The first aircraft, as I was saying, with a T-tailed aircraft was the BAC 111. The British Aircraft Corporation created this very successful aircraft, and it was in its final stages of testing by a fellow called Mike Lithgow, and they took off on this particular day out of Dunsfold to climb and test for a deep stall. A deep stall is beyond a stall. If you get into a stall and you continue to pull the stick back, you're going to go into a deep stall. Now, the aircraft had to be tested in that configuration, and it was. It climbed to 35,000 feet, and Mike Lithgow put it into a deep stall. It was then that he couldn't get out of a deep stall. The aircraft immediately started to speed up. The wash from the wings would hit the top of the T-tail and push it back into a deep stall again. And that's the way it came, all the way from 35,000 feet, despite everything that the crew could do to save it. And it smashed into the earth a few blocks away from where it took off, just north of Dunsfold. And Mike Lithgow and his 7 crew members were killed. This, of course, was a tragedy for the British Aircraft Corporation. I mean, what were they going to do? They had all these orders. The aircraft was going to be a very successful aircraft. How could they stop it now? But with a design like that, what were they going to do? And some bright spark came up with the idea that can't you arrange for the aircraft never to get into that position? And they thought that might be the answer. And consequently, the stick push was invented. All T-tail commercial aircraft from then on had to have a stick push. Now that operated as you approached the stall. The first thing you'd experience was a stick shaker. And if you were stupid enough to ignore that, to go on into a deep stall, immediately you did, the stick would come hard forward into the combing panel, and all the strength that you could apply could not stop it. And in this way, all T-tailed aircraft were equipped with a stick push, and you could never, ever get into a deep stall. So that was the story of the stick push. Now, we're now into the 70s, and the terrible thing that happened then to the company was the oil shock. The price of oil was around about $25 a barrel at the time. The Arabs decided to improve their political situation to wake the world up, as they thought they would increase the price of oil, and they pushed it up to over $70 a barrel. Now the VC-10 was equipped with straight-through jets and very expensive on fuel. So the company was faced with a dilemma. They really couldn't operate at those costs, and they ran into the red and things looked quite gloomy. At that time, a Scottish company known as Caledonian took an interest in taking over British United Airways. Caledonian ran Boeing 707s, which were fan jets and much cheaper on fuel, and also it had a greater capacity. So therefore, they made an approach to British United Airways and raised the capital, we assumed through the Scottish banks, enough to buy the company out. It then became a very difficult situation for the British United Airways pilots because it was a minnow taking over a very large airline. And they were the guys that had the aeroplanes, because British United sold all its aircraft to the Air Force, who turned them into tankers. Seniority was a big point. We had 3 times the number of pilots that Caledonian had, but we couldn't fly their aeroplanes. We had no license to fly 707s. So the Caledonian pilots had to come in and teach us. So going from a hugely sophisticated aircraft like a VC-10 down to a 707, we thought was a terrible retrograde step. In fact, we always thought of a 707 as being a very, very nice piece of agricultural equipment. That is compared with the VC-10. However, it was more economical, and that's really what Freddie Laker had to look. There was a lot of ill feeling in the company, because how do you divide seniority up with few pilots and massive pilots? And that caused a lot of dissension. Anyway, things drifted on until the time when the company looked towards replacing the 707. By the mid-70s, the company's plan was to replace the 707s with DC-10s. Now, I worked out that by the time the DC-10 came into service, I would be approaching the end of my career. And since the company was so heavily into making a profit, it's quite likely that I would be refused a conversion. Conversions are very expensive. Unless the company can get a considerable number of years flying out of you, they don't consider the amount of money spent would be worth it. So that's in conjunction with the rather pittance of a pension that I was offered. I decided that I'd have to do something to prepare myself for my eventual retirement. Now, the idea that occurred to me that the Arab world was opening up in the Gulf, and there might be an opportunity to earn some tax-free money. So I applied to the 3 actually, Saudi, Kuwait, and Bahrain were the three countries flying scheduled services in those days. The first to reply were Kuwait Airways, and since BOAC were the people that set them up in the first place, they were entirely British oriented, which was suitable for me because I had British licenses. Now their fleet was 707s for long haul and 727s for feeder services around the Arab world. The country itself was a little postage stamp country. You can drive through it in less than an hour, and it's situated at the top of the Arabian Gulf. It is, ladies and gentlemen, one huge oil field. The company has mind-blowing amounts of money. If you can imagine a person pulling out their checkbook and writing a check to Boeing for one of our first 747s for $50 million, it might give you some idea of the huge amount of money in that country. And that was back in 1975. What could it possibly be worth today? I mean, the route structure of the company was from Seoul in the east to New York in the west, and its feeder airlines were all from all over the Arab world. To work for a company that couldn't care whether they made a profit or not, it was staggering from my point of view, and of course incredibly enjoyable. There's nothing that you might request that they wouldn't buy. It really was amazing. So there are only 500,000 Kuwaitis in this little postage stamp of a country. In 1980, I actually worked out on their oil revenues how much each Kuwaiti might be worth. And that, in 1980, ladies and gentlemen, added up to $76 million. No Kuwaiti had a house. They all had little palaces. And it was quite amusing because I'm getting ahead of myself here. So having settled down in Kuwait, they offered me the job of fleet manager of the 707 fleet. And I said I would accept that post, providing they could assure me that when the 707 were replaced by 747s, that I would be allowed to come off that occupation into ordinary line flying on the 747. That was simply because, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to feel that I started off on the smallest and ended up on the biggest at that time. And so, the internal layout of the first 747, I mean, as soon as the Kuwaitis looked at the model, they said, no, we can't have that. It had a circular staircase up to the first class apartment on the top. And passengers may look up the girls' skirts. So they paid thousands of dollars for the whole internal aircraft to be rearranged so we had a straight stairway up to the first class, which of course was not ever suited for passengers because it was all arranged for drinking and gambling. Now I say that because the Kuwaitis are very hypocritical. They claim to be very, very good Sunnis, and really, if they came on board, were not allowed to serve alcohol on board because that was against Muslim teaching. But there's no reason why passengers couldn't bring their own And as you watch the passengers walking out to the aircraft, they would have all their alcohol in a bag as they go on board. And then they would settle down with their cards and grog and enjoy the flight. The people in the tourist class were rarely Kuwaitis, they were other people. There were, as I said, only 500,000 Kuwaitis, and they employed something like 600,000 people to look after them. Every company in Kuwait had to be owned by a Kuwaiti, so that if you decided to start business in Kuwait, the first thing you had to do was to get a sponsor. Now, that meant that you had to give away 51% of your company to a Kuwaiti to be able to open a company in Kuwait. Now, that meant that this Kuwaiti, who probably knew nothing about your company, had the power to close it down if they wished, or have you deported, or whatever he felt like, because he really owned the company, and any profits that were made were separated in that fashion. He would get 51% of them, and the hard-working people who ran the company would get 49% of the company. If you watched carefully the way the passengers were divided on your aircraft, you would see that the Kuwaitis sent off their wives to Paris and other beautiful places. And they would arrive on the aircraft complete in their abayas. So those completely black things. By the time you reached the top of climb, these ladies had been into the toilet and changed into the very best of Paris fashions. And there they would remain in that garb and other beautiful dresses until they reached top descent back into Kuwait at the end of their holiday. The men, on the other hand, would, with all their pocketfuls of money, go to the flesh pots of gambling or anything else. When we were I was operating out of the Arabian Gulf. As I said, there were only 3 airlines in that area, and that was Saudi, Kuwait, and Gulf Air. Gulf Air were operating out of Bahrain. The other countries, little companies, were beginning to take an interest. And why I raise this point is that Abu Dhabi decided that they would build themselves an airfield. Now they did so, and the Sheikh happened to be on holidays in Canada when he saw what he thought was the most perfect terminal building. And he had the identical building built in Abu Dhabi. And there it was, straight from Calgary to Abu Dhabi, complete with snowshoots and everything else you could possibly imagine. But that's, of course, all been swept away now, and they have incredibly modern airfields, as you well know. Probably the biggest and most modern in the world now. So, that just about brings me to the end of my aviation career. And before I finish, I'd like to just look into the future. I heard a lovely story about the first all-electronic aircraft to fly from London to New York. This aircraft took itself off, climbed itself to 60,000 feet, and then the public consent system came on. The voice said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you've been honored to fly on the first all-electronic aircraft from London to New York, and you are being controlled entirely from the ground. You're cruising now at 60,000 feet, at just below Mach 2, engine, we estimate your arrival in New York will be in 2 hours' time. Do sit back, enjoy your flight, and we assure you there is no reason to worry, to worry, to worry, to worry. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.